Imagine a world where the future didn't fly on wings, but floated. Imagine a time when the largest moving objects ever conceived by man, ships longer than the great ocean liners, didn't sail the sea, but cruised silently through the stratosphere, carrying luxury passengers from New York to Berlin, or acting as the ultimate unstoppable aircraft carriers for the U.S. Navy. They were called the Sky Giants, the rigid airships, and for a brief, glorious, and terrifying decade, they were the absolute peak of American technological ambition. They promised to shrink the globe and change the face of warfare forever. Then, in a terrifying flash of fire and wreckage, they vanished, leaving behind only the cold, beautiful ghosts of what might have been. This is the story of that dream, a race against the world, and the tragic price of reaching for the heavens. The year is 1922. The Great War is over, but the air is thick with a new kind of tension, a technological one. In Europe, Germany is crippled, yet her engineers have given the world a revolutionary, terrifying gift, the rigid airship, the Zeppelin. The sheer scale of these craft is breathtaking. They are, simply put, the largest machines on Earth, floating cathedrals of metal, fabric, and gas. A typical American skyscraper of the era might stand 400 feet tall. The newest Zeppelins stretched nearly 800 feet long. In the United States, a rising global power, the sight of a massive airship, especially one with a military pedigree, was a deeply unsettling mix of inspiration and fear. The American military, particularly the Navy, saw the writing on the wall. If these colossal aerial dreadnoughts could cross the Atlantic, they could scout vast swaths of the Pacific, changing naval strategy overnight. Whoever ruled the skies with these giants would rule the waves. The U.S. Navy's response was immediate and ambitious. They would not just build Zeppelins, they would build better ones. Their airships would be bigger, faster, and, most importantly, they would be filled not with flammable hydrogen, the gas that powered the German giants, but with the world's only known non-flammable lighter-than-air gas, helium. The decision to go all in on helium was a truly audacious stroke of genius and a colossal logistical gamble. In the early 1920s, the only reliable commercial source of helium was in the United States, specifically in Texas and Oklahoma. This gave America a monumental advantage, a strategic resource almost as valuable as oil. The U.S. government, understanding its implications for military superiority, declared a national monopoly on the gas. American airships would be the only ones in the world that, in theory, could not explode or burn in the air. They would be safe. This safety promise was the cornerstone of the entire American rigid airship program, But it came with a staggering financial cost and a significant engineering compromise. Helium provides about 92% of the lift of hydrogen. To achieve the same payload, American airships had to be inherently larger and more complex.
The airship that launched the great American race was the USS Shenandoah ZR-1. Her name, meaning Daughter of the Stars in an American Indian language, was evocative of the great hopes placed upon her. Commissioned in 1923, Shenandoah was built in Lakehurst, New Jersey, inside the massive, cavernous Hangar No. 1, a structure so vast it created its own weather systems. It was a factory, a cathedral, and a launch pad for the future, all in one. She was technically a copy of a captured German design, the L-49, but heavily modified. Her 70,000 individual parts were all American-made. She spanned 680 feet long and was constructed using a new alloy called duralumin, a delicate, feather-light metal framework that looked like a gigantic, intricate birdcage. Inside this frame were 20 gas cells holding over 2 million cubic feet of precious American helium. The men who crewed her were a special breed. They were not merely sailors or pilots. They were airshipmen, part engineer, part navigator, part stuntman. Commander Zachary Lansdowne, her first captain, was a brilliant naval officer who had served as the U.S. Navy's representative in Germany, learning the secrets of the Zeppelin firsthand. He was a meticulous, cautious leader, fully aware that he commanded a prototype, a multi-million-dollar experiment carrying the hopes of an entire military branch. Shenandoah was a triumph of engineering and national pride. On her maiden voyages, she drew crowds of hundreds of thousands. People would stop their cars on highways and stand for hours just to watch the silver Leviathan drift silently overhead. The sight was humbling, beautiful, and a potent symbol of American ingenuity. In 1924, Shenandoah achieved a remarkable feat, a round-trip transcontinental journey across the United States. The voyage was intended to showcase the airship's potential as a long-range scout and to boost morale. It was a monumental logistical challenge, requiring temporary mooring masts to be erected in places like Fort Worth, Texas, and San Diego, California. The journey itself was a sustained adventure. Crew members lived in cramped quarters inside the keel, the triangular tunnel running along the bottom of the ship, climbing up ladders and through crawl spaces to reach their stations or the control car, which hung beneath the nose. Life aboard was a constant battle against the elements and the limitations of the craft. Navigation was by sextant, radio was intermittent, and the noise from the 5 powerful engines which drove 2-bladed propellers was deafening. They ate in shifts, slept in hammocks, and were, for weeks at a time, entirely dependent on a delicate web of metal, fabric, and gas suspended miles above the earth.
The transcontinental trip was a success, but it contained the first ominous warnings that the Navy chose to ignore. Airships are creatures of the weather. They are slow and massive, and while they can outrun many storm systems, they cannot simply turn around or climb above them with the ease of a modern airplane. In the early morning hours of September 3, 1925, Shenandoah was on a public relations tour over the American Midwest. Commander Lansdowne, despite his cautious nature, was under pressure from his superiors in Washington, D.C., to follow a demanding schedule of flyovers. The airship was passing near the town of Caldwell, Ohio, in the Appalachian foothills. Lansdowne had a fundamental distrust of navigating over the continental landmass, arguing that the rapid temperature changes and sharp topography generated sudden, unpredictable thunder squalls far more dangerous than the steady winds of the open ocean. His worst fears were about to be realized. At approximately 5:20 a.m., the Shenandoah was swallowed by a violent squall line. The turbulence was immediate and extreme. The metal framework creaked and groaned under stresses it was never meant to endure. Up in the control car, the crew fought to keep the nose down, battling vertical drafts that slammed the 680-foot giant up and down like a feather. The airshipmen were performing an intricate, desperate dance. They had to continuously valve the precious helium, releasing the lift gas to prevent the cells from bursting due to expansion in the lower atmospheric pressure of the squall's updraft. Then they had to water ballast, dropping hundreds of gallons of water collected from condensed engine exhaust to gain lift when the ship was slammed downward. This was the fundamental, deadly cycle of airship flight, sacrificing precious resources to survive a squall. The violence of the storm was too much. A sudden, massive updraft caught the airship's tail, followed instantly by a downdraft that caused the entire structure to jackknife. With a horrific, grinding shriek of stressed duralumin, the main structure failed. The control car, with Commander Lansdowne and 6 other men, plummeted instantly to the ground. Lansdowne, his executive officer, and
5 others died instantly in the Ohio countryside. The forward section, still buoyant with helium, shot upward uncontrollably into the morning sky. The remaining crew fought for hours to bring the section down safely, eventually crash landing in a field with no further loss of life. The middle and rear sections fell away nearby. The destruction of the USS Shenandoah and the death of her beloved commander was a profound shock to the nation. It was the first disaster of the American rigid airship program, and it immediately sparked a national debate. Was the airship inherently unsafe, or was it simply a victim of political pressure and unforgiving weather? The Navy's answer was grimly deterministic, a tragic but necessary learning experience. They had a bigger dream to pursue, and for that they needed far bigger airships. The Shenandoah disaster was the end of the first chapter, but it was just the prelude to the Golden Age and the greater tragedies that were yet to come. The Navy pressed on, channeling the grief and the hard-won lessons into 2 even more massive, more revolutionary vessels, the USS Akron and the USS Macon.
The Shenandoah was an imitation. The USS Akron and her sister ship, the USS Macon, were pure, uncompromising American innovation. They were designed not just to scout, but to fight. Their mission was nothing less than to reinvent the very concept of a naval fleet. These 2 ships, commissioned between 1931 and 1933, were true behemoths, the largest flying objects ever built, even larger than the German LZ-129 Hindenburg that would become famous later. Each airship was 785 feet long, a foot shorter than the ill-fated Titanic was long, and nearly 133 feet in diameter. They contained over 6.5 million cubic feet of helium, making them capable of operating over vast, unrefueled distances. But the Akron and Macon had a secret weapon, a revolutionary capability that defined the second age of American rigid airships and made them entirely unique in the history of flight: the hangar in the sky. Deep inside the massive hull, above the control car, was a dedicated hangar bay. From this bay, through a large T-shaped opening in the keel, the airships could launch and recover 5 small fixed-wing aircraft, Grumman F-9C Sparrowhawk biplanes, using a device called the Skyhook. The concept was simple, terrifying, and brilliant. The Sparrowhawk would fly beneath the airship, and the pilot would have to line up a small hook on the top wing with a trapeze bar dangling from the airship's hull. The airship would slow down, the trapeze would retract, and the fighter plane would be literally winched up into the hangar bay, its engine turned off for storage and rearming. The airshipmen who flew the Sparrowhawks were dubbed the Hookmen. Their job was one of the most perilous in aviation history. Imagine flying a biplane at 80 miles per hour, trying to thread a needle with a rope, while that needle is attached to a 785-foot-long object floating thousands of feet in the air. The slightest bump, a sudden shift in the airship's momentum, or a missed connection could be fatal. Yet these young aviators mastered the technique, turning the Akron and Macon into the world's first successful, fully operational flying aircraft carriers. The strategic implications were staggering. A naval battle group could send out the Akron to scout hundreds of miles ahead, her Hookman launching to engage enemy scouts or to provide detailed targeting information to the main fleet, then returning to the safety of the floating carrier to refuel and rearm. The Akron and Macon could cover distances no battleship or conventional aircraft carrier of the day could match. They were the ultimate expression of the naval maxim, "Who sees first, shoots first."
Life aboard the Akron was unlike anything else in the U.S. Navy. The ship was a flying city with a crew of over 70 men and officers. Inside the keel, which was wide enough to walk upright in, there were berthing compartments, a galley, a radio room, a dedicated meteorological office, and even a small smoking room, the only part of the ship where a match was ever allowed to be struck, carefully protected by a double airlock. The men would watch the world drift silently below from the ports of the control car, gazing down on an America struggling through the Great Depression. From their vantage point, the problems of the ground seemed distant and small. They were literally living above the fray, in a golden cocoon of technological progress. The ship's commander was a post of immense responsibility and prestige. The early captain of the Akron was a renowned officer, but the ship's career was marred by a constant push-pull between the cautious aviators and the ambitious politicians and admirals in Washington. There was an insistent demand to show off the asset, to prove its utility, and to justify the colossal $8 million price tag, an astronomical figure in 1930. This pressure led to the inevitable. Just as with the Shenandoah, the need to perform and impress meant accepting risks that the engineers and crew knew were fundamentally dangerous. The Akron had demonstrated her capabilities, performing successful exercises over the Atlantic. But the elements, the one force even an airship cannot fully master, were waiting. April 4, 1933. Detail the final, fatal voyage of the USS Akron. It was a routine training flight off the New Jersey coast.
The unforeseen storm. Describe the sudden, ferocious squall the Akron encountered near Barnegat Light. Engineering versus reality. Explain the engineering weaknesses, the unproven vertical fin structure, the tendency of helium to be vented for control, and the critical failure of the altimeter system. The crash. Detail the moment of the crash into the sea. The tragedy of the Akron was that only 3 of the 76 men survived. The fact that the ship was filled with non-flammable helium did not save them from the storm and the sea. The lack of life vests and lifeboats on deck was a fatal oversight. The legacy continues. The Macon was the Akron's sister ship and was built incorporating all the lessons learned from the Akron and Shenandoah disasters. The Golden Age of Scouting. Describe the Macon's triumphant service with the Pacific Fleet, based out of Sunnyvale, California, Moffett Field. She was used to scout hundreds of miles of the Pacific coast. The Hookmen's Glory. Detail the successful operations of the Sparrowhawk fighter planes. Focus on a specific mission or a daring pilot who mastered the skyhook technique. This is the peak of the American airship dream. The fragile structure. Focus on the structural issues that plagued the Macon. The duralumin framing was prone to fatigue and failure due to constant flexing in flight. February 12, 1935. The Macon is caught in a violent storm off the coast of Point Sur, California. The catastrophic failure. Detail the failure of the top stabilizing fin, causing major structural damage. The rear gas cells are vented, and the ship loses control. The controlled descent. Unlike the Akron, the Macon's captain, Commander Herbert Wiley, managed to maintain control and conducted a slow, controlled sinking into the Pacific Ocean. Survival. Because the crew had been issued life vests after the Akron disaster, 81 of the 83 men survived the crash, floating in the Pacific until rescue. This was a testament to the hard-won lessons of the past. The loss of the Macon marked the end of the American rigid airship program. The Navy, having lost 3 of its 4 large rigid airships, could not justify the cost or the risk anymore. The focus shifted entirely to the smaller, more reliable, and faster fixed-wing aircraft. The hydrogen dream. Contrast the American helium story with the German hydrogen program, focusing on the construction of the LZ-129 Hindenburg. The helium embargo. detail the political decision to refuse the export of American helium to Germany for the Hindenburg. This forced Germany to use highly flammable hydrogen, setting the stage for the final, iconic disaster. May 6, 1937. Detail the arrival and fire of the Hindenburg in Lakehurst, New Jersey, at the very same base where the Shenandoah was built. The fire, captured on film and radio, delivered the final, indelible image of airship danger to the world. The legacy. Discuss the airship's true contribution to the future of flight, including advances in materials, navigation, and aerodynamics. Moffett Field and Lakehurst today. Describe the massive, silent hangars left behind. Hangar 1 in California and Hangar Number 1 in New Jersey, as monuments to the lost dream. The Airshipmen. Trace the careers of the surviving officers and crew who went on to become naval leaders and astronauts. Conclusion. Reflect on the historical reality that these airships were too far ahead of their time, victims of a technology that was a generation or two too immature for the forces of nature it was meant to conquer. The dream of the sky giants remains a beautiful, terrifying, historical curiosity. The road not taken in the history of American aviation. The calendar had just turned to April 1933. The Great Depression was at its crushing peak, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just begun his revolutionary first 100 days. In this atmosphere of national anxiety, the colossal U.S. Akron was not just a ship. She was a promise of technology conquering hard times, a soaring symbol of American capability. The Akron was scheduled for a routine training flight, an operational exercise designed to test her capacity for long-distance scouting and, critically, to practice the recovery of her Hookman pilots and their Sparrowhawk fighter planes. The mission was to take her down the mid-Atlantic coast and back. Her commander for this fateful voyage was not her usual highly experienced airship captain, but Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and the very architect of the U.S. Navy's rigid airship program. Moffett was a true visionary, an absolute believer in the military necessity of these giants. He was making this trip to personally inspect the operations and, perhaps more importantly, to lobby Congress for the necessary funds to build more ships. His presence turned a training exercise into a high-stakes political demonstration. Moffett brought along a sizable contingent of high-ranking officers and even a civilian observer, dramatically swelling the normal crew complement.
On the evening of April 3, 1933, the Akron lifted silently from her hangar in Lakehurst, New Jersey, carrying 76 souls, the largest number of men ever put into the air on a single airship. The launch was smooth, and the early hours of the flight were uneventful. The giant ship moved effortlessly south, paralleling the coastline. For the officers and crew, life inside the massive keel was routine. The cooks prepared meals in the galley, the hookmen checked their planes in the hangar bay, and the navigators plotted the course. A silver city floating thousands of feet above the dark, cold Atlantic. But as the Akron turned back north near the Virginia Capes, the meticulous forecasts from the Navy's Weather Bureau began to sour. The radio room received warnings of a rapidly developing low-pressure system off the coast, a powerful, vicious squall line churning up the seaboard. The ship's watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley, who would later command the Macon, was deeply uneasy. Airship doctrine dictated that they should never deliberately fly into a known severe weather front. The prudent course of action would have been to turn the ship eastward, out over the open ocean, or to find a safe anchorage. But Admiral Muffet was aboard. The desire to keep to the schedule, to demonstrate the airship's all-weather capability to the distinguished guests, and to avoid the political embarrassment of having to turn tail from a storm, prevailed over caution. The order was given: hold the course.
The storm descended on the Akron around 10 p.m. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a physical assault. The wind hit the ship like a concrete wall. Inside the control car, the crew suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against the air itself. The primary danger came from a phenomenon common in large squalls: the vertical shear. The storm contained powerful, localized updrafts and downdrafts, essentially throwing the 785-foot Leviathan up and down like a child's toy. The airship's control surfaces, the rudder and the elevators, used to steer and control the pitch, were now completely ineffective. They were simply too small and too slow to counteract the atmospheric violence. The Akron was entirely at the mercy of the wind. The crew's struggle was a desperate, multifaceted engineering battle. Pitch control. The airship was forced into extreme nose-up and nose-down attitudes. The captain ordered the engines to full power, their two-bladed propellers straining to provide thrust to push the nose back to level. But the force of the wind made the engines scream in protest. The helium battle. As the ship was slammed upwards, the atmospheric pressure dropped. The precious helium inside the 20 gas cells expanded rapidly. To prevent the fabric cells from rupturing, the valve man had to continuously pull the cords, venting thousands of cubic feet of non-renewable helium into the night. This was a direct sacrifice of lift, a trade-off for survival. The ballast race. With helium being rapidly vented, the ship began to lose lift and descend. The crew then had to drop ballast, water carried in internal tanks, to arrest the descent. It was a terrifying cycle. Vent gas to survive the updraft, then drop water to survive the subsequent downdraft. Each action brought the ship closer to an unrecoverable state. By midnight, they were flying in near-zero visibility, the roar of the wind and the engines making communication difficult. They were blindly battling the unseen monster in the dark sky, somewhere off the coast of Barnegat Light, New Jersey.
The crucial, devastating sequence of failures began around 12:30 a.m. on April 4th, 1933. The ship, already laboring, was slammed downward by a powerful downdraft. The captain ordered all engines to full reverse to try and slow the descent. But a catastrophic, cascading failure occurred in the control room. The altimeter failure. The Akron was equipped with 2 sets of altimeters. One measured pressure altitude, which was nearly useless in the violently changing pressure of the storm. The other was a radio altimeter, which could accurately measure the height above the actual sea surface. Due to poor design, or perhaps human error in the chaos, the radio altimeter was located near the ceiling of the control car, where it was awkward to read. The crew was forced to rely on the pressure altimeter, which gave wildly inaccurate high readings in the storm. Believing they were still thousands of feet above the water, the captain ordered the ship to full nose up. But they were desperately close to the ocean's surface. The ship lurched violently nose up. The sheer force of the wind, combined with the extreme pitch, caused the tail to dip rapidly. The lower fin, which housed a tail-mounted engine car, dipped into the massive churning waves. The engine car was instantly ripped away by the immense force of the water. With it went 4 men inside. The crew felt the agonizing shudder run through the entire 785-foot length of the ship. The loss of the engine car instantly threw the ship into an uncontrollable climb, as the sudden loss of weight in the tail pitched the nose up even further. The captain ordered the nose down and called for emergency ballast drops, but it was too late. All the available ballast water had been dropped during the earlier fight with the squall. They had nothing left to counteract the loss of the tail section. The Akron, now crippled and mortally wounded, shot upward uncontrollably. The colossal airship, now thousands of pounds lighter in the tail and severely gas-depleted, rose several thousand feet, then stalled. It hung suspended in the black, stormy night for a horrifying minute,
the frame creaking like a dying beast. Then, with an agonizing inevitability, the great ship began its final, irreversible plunge. It descended tail first at terrifying speed. The fabric shell hit the water violently. Unlike the Shenandoah, which broke up, the Akron acted like a massive, fragile balloon slammed onto a hard surface. The impact crumpled the delicate metal framework inside, instantly killing most of the men stationed in the keel, including Admiral Moffett. The tragedy of the Akron was compounded by a simple, terrifying irony. It was filled with helium, the non-flammable wonder gas, which meant there was no fire. The ship did not burn, it simply sank. The crew had been ordered to keep their heavy naval coats on, but there was a fatal oversight. There were very few life vests aboard, and they were difficult to access in the panic of the final moments. The ship carried only one small rubber raft. The freezing cold, churning waters of the Atlantic swallowed the massive wreck quickly. The men who survived the impact were instantly fighting the elements. Only 3 men survived the USS Akron disaster, 2 enlisted men, and the ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley. They were rescued hours later by a German freighter, the Phoebus, which spotted their small rubber raft in the faint light of the rising sun. The final toll was 73 lives lost, a devastating blow to the U.S. Navy, and the single deadliest accident in airship history, surpassing even the later Hindenburg disaster. Among the dead was Admiral Moffett, the very visionary who staked his career on the success of the rigid airship. His death was not just a personal tragedy, it was the symbolic beheading of the entire American program. The subsequent Navy Board of Inquiry attributed the loss to unpredictable weather and insufficient ballast. But the real underlying cause was the fundamental flaw in the rigid airship doctrine, the necessity of flying these delicate giants through all conditions, often for political reasons, before the technology and forecasting were truly mature enough to ensure their safety. The loss of the Akron left her identical sister ship, the USS Macon, as the sole remaining giant in the U.S. Navy's fleet. The Navy was determined to prove the Akron's death was an anomaly, not a condemnation of the entire program. They had lost their champion and their commander, but they still had the Pacific Fleet's eyes in the sky. All the hopes of the golden age of airships now rested entirely on the magnificent USS Macon. I have now completed Chapter 2, keeping the continuous narrative style,
To reach 70,000 words, Chapter 3 would need to be expanded significantly to cover the Macon's commissioning, the extensive modifications made after the Akron's loss, detailed descriptions of life aboard, and a thorough chronicle of the Hookman's daring operational flights over the Pacific. We will now move on to the brief but glorious career of the ultimate naval giant.
The tragedy of the Akron had barely settled when the USS Macon ZR Hive was commissioned in June 1933. She was the absolute realization of the American airship dream, and every lesson learned, or tragically paid for, by the Shenandoah and the Akron was theoretically built into her structure. The Macon was identical in size to her lost sister, 785 feet of polished duralumin and silken fabric. But she was a ship of significant improvements. Her primary assignment was to the Pacific Fleet, and she was home-ported at the massive, newly constructed Muffet Federal Airfield in Sunnyvale, California, named in honor of the admiral who perished aboard the Akron. The construction of Muffet Field was itself a staggering feat of engineering, featuring the monumental Hangar 1, a structure covering 8 acres, so large that, like Lakehurst's Hangar No. 1, it became a local landmark, visible for miles. The entire facility was a testament to the fact that, despite the disaster, the Navy was not giving up the airship dream. The cost was too high, the potential too great. The key changes made to the Macon were focused on survival and control. Most critically, the Navy ensured that every crew member was issued a life vest, and multiple emergency life rafts were readily accessible, a direct, grim lesson from the Akron's sinking. The engineering department also redesigned the Akron's flimsy lower vertical stabilizer fin, which was where the final structural failure began. They also improved the airship's internal bracing and updated the faulty altimeter systems. The Macon was, on paper, the safest rigid airship ever built. Her first commander, until his retirement, was none other than Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley, one of the 3 survivors of the Akron disaster. Wiley, carrying the weight of his lost comrades, commanded the Macon with a palpable mixture of intense caution and professional dedication. No one knew the dangers of the sky better than he did. Under Wiley's command, the Macon quickly proved her worth as the ultimate naval scout. Her immense range and endurance, capable of remaining aloft for days, allowed her to patrol areas of the Pacific that no conventional ship or seaplane could reach. In the context of the rising geopolitical tensions with Japan over the Pacific territories, the Macon's ability to provide early warning and reconnaissance was deemed invaluable. The Macon's greatest operational success came in her role as a flying aircraft carrier. Her 5 Grumman F-9C Sparrowhawk biplanes, the Hookman, were the true innovation. The combination of the airship's long-range eyes and the speed of the attached aircraft was revolutionary. Imagine this scene. The Macon is cruising silently at 3,000 feet over the vast, empty Pacific. A radio signal is picked up, indicating a distant, unknown naval task force. The call goes out. Man the planes! Hookmen to stations! 4 biplanes are lowered, one by one, through the T-shaped bay in the belly of the ship. The noise of the engines starting inside the hull is deafening. The hangar chief confirms the hook is locked. With a jerk, the plane drops free, its pilot immediately diving away from the massive hull. They fly outward in formation, scouting hundreds of miles in every direction. They locate the task force, identify the vessels, and radio the coordinates back to the Macon. Then comes the real magic, the recovery. The Hookman pilot, after a long, lonely flight, has to re-rendezvous with the immense, slow-moving mothership. He would position his small biplane directly beneath the airship, fighting his controls to match the ship's speed perfectly. The airship would drop the trapeze. The pilot had to hold his aircraft steady, often in turbulent air, until the small hook on the top of his upper wing caught the bar. The moment of connection was jarring. The entire biplane would swing violently like a pendulum before the hydraulic winch smoothly retracted it back up into the ship's hull. The airshipman would greet the pilot with a cheer. The entire delicate operation completed in seconds. The Macon performed dozens of these recoveries, proving the concept beyond a doubt. The sight of the Hookman taking off and landing beneath the colossal hull was the ultimate spectacle of American aviation. A moment when the airship seemed to have achieved its destiny as the king of the sky. Despite its successes, the USS Macon was a giant creature built from a delicate, ambitious dream. Her immense duralumin structure, though light and revolutionary, was constantly under stress. Engineers had raised concerns about the structural fatigue of the main ring frames and the vertical stabilizers, the very components that had initiated the fatal failure of the Akron. The Navy, however, was eager to prove the airship's operational reliability and pressed the Macon into continuous service with the Pacific Fleet. The final fatal flight began on February 12, 1935. The Macon was scouting off the coast of Point Sur, California, near Big Sur, a coastline notorious for its abrupt and violent weather changes, where ocean currents meet rugged mountains. The weather forecast was concerning. A rapidly intensifying low-pressure system was sweeping in from the Pacific. Commander Herbert Wiley, the veteran who survived the Akron disaster, was no longer in command, having been promoted. The ship was under the command of Commander Dresden Lentz.
Around 5 p.m., the Macon encountered a severe wind shear, a concentrated, localized vortex of turbulence characteristic of the region. The effect on the massive 785-foot hull was immediate and violent. The ship was hit by an intense combination of crosswinds and downdrafts. The fatal stress point was the upper vertical fin, the rudder assembly located on the dorsal spine of the airship. This fin had been damaged months earlier in a close call at a mooring mast, and the subsequent repair, though deemed sufficient, was now revealing a critical weakness. The turbulence tore at the fragile structure. With a terrifying shriek of tortured metal, a large section of the upper vertical fin assembly sheared completely away from the main hull. The instantaneous effect of this structural failure was devastating. The tear in the fabric ripped open several of the internal helium cells in the stern of the ship. The precious, non-flammable gas began to escape rapidly into the atmosphere. The crew on the control car, thousands of feet forward, immediately felt the grim consequence. The ship became suddenly tail-heavy. The loss of gas in the rear was compounding the structural imbalance, pulling the entire stern of the magnificent ship downward into a steep, uncontrollable dive. The controlled descent and survival. Commander Lentz and the control crew fought desperately to save the ship. They ordered the immediate emergency venting of the forward helium cells. This was the ultimate, necessary sacrifice, releasing the lifeblood of the ship to try and balance the weight and bring the nose down. Simultaneously, the engines were pushed to full power, their propellers straining to push the nose back up and maintain forward momentum. For a grueling half-hour, the airshipmen battled the weight of the water-logged stern and the relentless downward pull. But the leak was too severe. The Macon began an inexorable, slow descent toward the churning, cold Pacific. This is where the tragic lessons of the Akron disaster proved to be the Macon's salvation. Unlike her sister, the Macon was sinking slowly and somewhat controllably. Most importantly, the crew was prepared. As the airship dropped toward the ocean, the order was given: abandon ship and inflate life vests. The men, now equipped with life vests and having witnessed the Akron's fate, knew exactly what to do. They gathered in the keel, preparing for the impact. When the massive hull finally struck the cold water, the impact was less of a crash and more of a gigantic, cushioned slump. The ship settled onto the surface, its vast volume of escaping helium slowing its descent and allowing it to remain afloat for several precious minutes. The crew members swiftly evacuated onto the readily accessible rubber rafts, paddling away from the rapidly sinking hulk. Only 2 men were lost in the disaster, a stunning and direct contrast to the 73 who perished aboard the Akron. The lives saved were the final bittersweet triumph of the American rigid airship program. Proof that technology could learn, even if it could not conquer. The USS Macon, the last of the naval sky giants, sank beneath the waves off Point Sur, her wreck settling onto the ocean floor, where it remains to this day, a pristine, preserved monument to a lost era.
The loss of the Macon in 1935 was the final, devastating blow to the U.S. Navy's rigid airship program. Having lost 3 of their 4 massive, multi-million-dollar airships in the span of a decade, Shenandoah, Akron, and Macon, the political and financial appetite for these giants vanished entirely. The Navy formally decommissioned the rigid airship program. The future of naval aviation clearly belonged to the fixed-wing aircraft carrier, which was faster, smaller, less vulnerable to weather, and vastly more cost-effective. The grand American dream of the flying aircraft carrier was over. The helium monopoly and the hydrogen consequence. Across the Atlantic, the German Zeppelin Company was completing its masterpiece, the LZ-129 Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was intended to prove the commercial viability of transatlantic air travel. But the American tragedy now informed the German peril. The U.S. still held the global monopoly on helium. Following the disasters and viewing helium as a critical strategic war resource, the U.S. Congress passed the Helium Control Act of 1927, which severely restricted its export, especially to countries deemed potential military rivals. In the mid-1930s, the German government, led by the increasingly aggressive Nazi regime, repeatedly petitioned the U.S. government to sell them helium for the Hindenburg. The U.S. government, driven by isolationist sentiments and a refusal to aid a growing military power, categorically refused. This decision forced the Germans to power their magnificent new airship with the only other viable lift gas, hydrogen. Hydrogen provided 8% more lift than helium, but it was violently, catastrophically flammable. The Germans were aware of the danger, but they had no choice. The Hindenburg launched its transatlantic passenger service in 1936, a majestic, luxurious spectacle of travel. It was the epitome of the airship as a transatlantic liner. But the final, indelible image of the entire golden age of airships was yet to be delivered. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg arrived in the United States on a foggy evening. She approached her mooring mast at Lakehurst Naval Air Station, New Jersey, the same field where the Shenandoah was built and the Akron began its final voyage. As she prepared to moor, a static spark, or perhaps a catastrophic rigging failure, ignited the extremely flammable hydrogen in the upper sections of the ship. What followed was captured on film and radio, etching the tragedy into global consciousness. The giant airship was consumed by fire in a little over 34 seconds. The radio announcer, Herbert Morrison, delivered the famous choked commentary, "Oh, the humanity! Oh, the humanity!" The Hindenburg disaster, though claiming fewer lives, 35 fatalities, than the Akron sinking, was the most public and visually spectacular end of the airship dream. The fiery image confirmed every fear the public had ever held about the rigid airship. The age of the sky giants was instantaneously, definitively over. The dream died, but the history remained. The American rigid airship program, despite its tragic ending, achieved incredible milestones and left a profound technological legacy. Technological inheritance. The engineers who designed the duralumin structures of the Akron and Macon pushed the boundaries of lightweight stress analysis and structural rigidity, lessons that were immediately applied to the burgeoning commercial airplane industry. The pioneering work in long-range radio communication and precise meteorological forecasting, developed out of the airship's operational necessity, became standard practice for all transatlantic aviation. The airshipmen themselves, the daring hookmen and the navigators, were some of the best aviators of their generation. Their training in extreme conditions and high-stakes maneuvering contributed directly to the U.S. Navy's preparation for World War II. Monuments to a lost future. Today, the most palpable legacy of the American airship dream are the massive structures that housed them. Hangar 1 at Moffett Field, California, still dominates the landscape, its vast vaulted roof a stunning reminder of the scale of the Macon. Hangar number 1 at Lakehurst, New Jersey, where the Hindenburg burned and the Shenandoah was born, remains one of the largest timber structures in the world. These hangars are silent, monumental cathedrals dedicated to a future that never arrived. The American rigid airship program was a beautiful, terrifying historical tangent. It was a race to build the impossible, to bridge continents, and to dominate the seas, all using a technology that was inherently vulnerable to the one force it could not defeat: the vast, untamable power of the atmosphere. The dream was majestic, the technology was breathtaking, and the price was tragically high. The sky giants remain the cold, beautiful ghosts of what might have been the golden age of flight.